Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that's in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. Is Atheism Dead? Is the book we're going through. It's written by Metaxas. Metaxas is a best-selling author. His books have been translated into 25 languages. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series, Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. In the Wall Street Journal some time ago, he wrote an article about the scientific evidence for God's existence. This time we're doing chapter 20, Is Atheism Evil? New atheists believe religion is somehow uniquely evil. It seems to them to be the expression and civilization of everything that must be hated. As we've said, this perspective is at least very silly, and more likely a number of far less anodyne things. And once again, the idea that they cannot take the trouble to distinguish between all religions and wish to throw them into the same stew pot only underscores the larger inanity of their fury. It's a strange fact, for example, that they genuinely pretend to be unaware of that hospitals and caring for the sick come out of a Christian worldview because Christians invented hospitals, or that the larger idea that those with wealth and power should care for those who are powerless and poor comes from the Bible. Because of their abysmally bleak worldview in which transcendence and meaning don't exist, atheists have no reason or motivation to care about injustice, and so they often don't. Or if they do so in contradiction of their larger philosophy. In any event, the new atheists really have accused religion in general of being especially and uniquely evil. This is very difficult to take seriously, especially for anyone with the slightest knowledge of the 20th century atheist governments. Even more difficult to take seriously is the idea that having dispensed with God, these men wish to talk of good and evil. Nonetheless, if they do wish to speak of good and evil, we might, for a moment, aim our spyglass at the proponents of atheism and see what happens when atheism is embraced by those with limitless power over their fellow human beings. And in this chapter, that's what they're going to do. They're going to show the result of atheist governments. Before 1991, the Oxford mathematician John Lennox traveled innumerable times to the Soviet Union and to Soviet bloc countries. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Lennox has gone back and spoken with those who once believed that communism might be a good thing, who thought that atheism could bring about a better world. We thought we could get rid of God, they said to him, and retain a value for human beings. They said we were wrong. We destroyed both God and man. Right. Man is only valuable if God exists, because under a theistic worldview, man is created in God's image and has infinite worth and value as a result. Isn't that the story of the 20th century? Once you get rid of God, you get rid of the idea that human beings have any inherent dignity or worth. It's unavoidable, and what happens in places where those ideas disappeared amounts to perhaps the most monstrous evil in all of human history. Lennox says some of his friends from Poland are amazed that there can be proponents of atheism after its unavoidably gruesome record, but they can know that Hitchens and Dawkins built a significant following through their books and speeches. Dawkins has lost contact with the realities of 20th century history, they said. Let him come here and talk to us. He's really open to listening to evidence of the link between atheism and atrocity. What an interesting point that there are people in other countries who see the link between atheism and atrocity. What happened under atheistic communism is hardly unknown, but the new atheists seem curiously untroubled by this. I'll confess that I was not aware of these things that I learned when I went through this chapter. Lennox counters the new atheist brilliantly in his book Gunning for God, as does David Berlinski in his book The Devil's Delusion, in which Berlinski writes, quote, somewhere in Eastern Europe, an SS officer watched languidly his machine gun cradled as an elderly and bearded Hasidic Jew laboriously dug what he knew to be his grave. Standing up straight, he addressed his executioner. God is watching what you're doing, he said. And then he was shot dead. what Hitler did not believe, and what Stalin did not believe, and what Mao did not believe, and what the SS did not believe, and what the Gestapo did not believe, and what the commissars, functionaries, swaggering executioners, Nazi doctors, Communist Party theoreticians, intellectuals, brown shirts, black shirts, gaulletiers, and 1,000 party hacks did not believe was that God was watching what they were doing. And when you don't believe God's watching what you're doing, there is a greater chance for no moral restraint. And as far as we can tell, very few of those carrying out the horrors of the 20th century worried over much that God was watching what they were doing either. That is, after all, the meaning of secular society. The willful myopia of the new atheists come to a sharp point in Dawkins's claim that atheism cannot lead anyone to violence. Well, we're about to see that's not true. Writing in Harper's Magazine, the novelist Marilyn Robinson answers this manifestly fatuous assertion. Quote by Robinson, "Why would anyone go to war for the sake of an absence of belief? It is a peculiarity of our language that by war we generally mean a conflict between nations, or at least one in which both sides are armed. There's been persistent violence against religion in the French Revolution, Spanish Civil War, and the Soviet Union and China. In 3 of these instances, the extirpation of religion was part of a program to reshape society by excluding certain forms of thought, by creating an absence of belief. Neither sanity nor happiness appears to have been served by the efforts. The kindest conclusion one can draw is that Dawkins has not acquainted himself with the history of modern authoritarianism." End quote. So here I have some hyperlinks to articles about the French Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, Soviet Union, and China. And I want to, and those articles, they're found on Wikipedia, they show how these regimes, which Wikipedia is oftentimes very anti-God in its content, each of these links demonstrate that there was violence against religion by people trying to remove the influence of God. Reviewing Hitchens' book in the Wall Street Journal, Peter Berkowitz pointed out that Hitchens was somehow adamantly opposed to making any distinction between authentic and corrupt and just and unjust religious teachings. End quote. So back on the previous slide, there's an article about the French Revolution, how atheist regimes committed violence against people of faith. The same thing happened in the Spanish Civil War, the same thing happened in the Soviet Union, and the same thing happened against China. People trying to have state-mandated atheism and harming people of faith. So Hitchens, of course, childishly insisted on maintaining his position that all religions are equally wrong and evil, while atheism, of course, is always right and good, which led Berkowitz to ask why the 20th century embrace of secularism unleashed human depravity of unprecedented proportions. End quote. John Gray, the professor of European thought at the London School of Economics, in his book Black Mass, says, quote, "The role of the Enlightenment in 20th century terror remains a blind spot in Western perception. Communist regimes were established in pursuit of a utopian ideal whose origins lie at the heart of the Enlightenment. Pre-modern theocracies used fear to enforce religious orthodoxy, but they did not aim to remodel humanity any more than traditional tyrannies. Leninism and Nazism aimed to achieve such a transformation." End quote. The German historian Arnold Engendent, in his internationally praised opus on church history, Tolerance and Gewalt, which translates to Tolerance and Violence, put it in precise perspective. Engendent says that the Spanish Inquisition from 1540 to the mid-18th century executed 827 people, and the Roman Inquisition killed 93. No one facing murder for what they believe or don't believe will be much buoyed by these low numbers, for even a single human being murdered along such lines is one human being too many. Nonetheless, the eagerness with which atheists have carried on about the unparalleled evils of the historical church betray the incontrovertible facts of history. Their emotional thunderings against the crimes committed in the name of religion are calculated to imply that the numbers murdered in the name of God must be limitless. This is not true. In fact, in Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, I believe that's the book, there's a portion in there where Copan demonstrates something like this too, where he shows that the amount of casualties in the biblical record pales in comparison to some other things. One wonders whether the atheist apologists are so dramatic in their exaggerations simply because they mean to win an emotional victory and thereby put their opponents on their heels. That seems to be the case in my experience. They seem to want to play on people's emotions, but facts are facts. So even the new atheist apologists ignore them. They exist. The facts exist, and it remains an unendurably horrible fact that dedicatedly atheist regimes in the last century alone tortured and murdered and multiplied millions, usually for their Jewish or Christian faith. Say that again. Dedicatedly atheist regimes in the last century alone tortured and murdered multiplied millions, usually for their Jewish or Christian faith. In fact, those murdered by the handful of atheist regimes amount to about 150 million. I mean, facts are facts. You want to argue with those facts? That's a lot of people killed in the name of anti-religion. Can anyone begin to fathom such numbers? The disparity between this grimmest of historical realities and the comparatively minuscule numbers of those murdered in God's name is almost too embarrassing to discuss. So it seems that Hitchens and others have gone out of their way to slap away any mention of the atheistic atrocities, even daring to say that this is that aspect of atheist regimes alone that bears striking resemblance to religion, which itself is an atrocity. A little hypocritical of them to say that it's the religion-only people that commit atrocities when we're showing in this chapter that that's not true. It is the sort of diabolical lie to which Stalin aspired, and that can never robustly enough be answered with words. The special wickedness of atheism in this arena cannot easily be escaped. Again, the historical facts are settled, but whenever it is brought up, the four horsemen seem with all alacrity to gallop toward the nearest arroyo, there to hide out till the coast is clear. The idea that 150 million human beings were murdered by atheist regimes might be the single most disturbing fact in the history of the human species. And yet, because of the cultural milieu of the West, we have somehow been unable to call those guilty on the carpet and have handled the devotees of this murderous creed, for such it is, with kid gloves, somehow feeling it would be unseemly to mention these things. Right. I mean, we're real quick to mention violence in the name of religion, but boy, you don't even hear them talk about this. I mean, it's a stain on their philosophy. But how can we any longer avoid our responsibility in this? We can no longer keep silent. Perhaps the principal reason we cannot now keep silent is that the devil's head specter of atheistic communism, naively thought gone in 1991, has roared back to power, mostly in China, where the atheistic leaders have sanctioned the torture and murder of Uyghur Muslims with special impunity, as well as Christians, Buddhists, numerous others who were unable to toe the atheistic party line. So since 1991, apparently, we have atheists torturing people of faith. That's odd that they would be doing this from so recently. But yet, people of faith are the ones that are evil? Really? But because of those suffering this moment, it is time we call out whoever would skip gaily past the mass graves. The blood of those murdered in the name of atheistic totalitarianism cries out for justice, and if we cannot at least acknowledge these unavoidable facts, what does that say about us? We cannot therefore any longer allow militant atheists to accuse Christians or the church for every evil under the sun when they cannot honestly address the facts of human history. These include the fact that the Crusades were military operations conducted almost exclusively in defense of attacks from the martially inclined Muslims, whom Hitchens throws into the same pile as other religious offenders, such as the violent and bloodthirsty Quakers, Shakers, and Millerites. We really must have clarity on these things. So yes, it is an ironic and nightmarish fact that in the very short time during which atheism was adopted by entire nations, it stands alone in history as guilty of the very things which the horsemen accuse the Christian church. How Hitchens in particular squirmed from under such marmoreal heavy historical realities, like much else in his bag of forensic tricks, is almost humorous in its audacity. Almost. He dared to say that the extent any atheistic regimes were guilty of such things, they were, are you ready, behaving in ways remarkably similar to organized religions. So he justifies it because it behaves like a religion? That is the height of hypocrisy. In this statement alone, he earns his reputation as the hammer-wielding St. George from whom every problem becomes a fire-breathing religious nail. More to the point, however, this is a level of sophistry that even for a man to whom sophistry became a kind of god cannot seriously be excused by the rest of us. As we say, it's an incontrovertible, and for atheists, a damning fact, that murder by militant atheist regimes is a fact of such Himalayan proportions that it tends to block our sight from anything or of anything beyond it. So, however such apologists for atheist murders might hope to deflect us, we must press on. The murder's the thing. It's so well documented as to be starkly beyond dispute. There is simply no way to escape this indictment other than to ignore it by shouting anything else as loudly as possible. But if we're interested not merely in facts, but in truth, we can't be distracted. We can't ignore it. Because these are telling facts, telling of an inhumanity beyond imagining, telling of the skyscraping world without God. Of course, numbers like 150 million are so huge and so abstract that they can be numbing. So let's be more specific. In the year 1957 alone, the decidedly atheistic Soviets murdered 106,300 clergymen. They hoped that this would help in eradicating the evil of Christian religion. If you've ever been in a stadium capable of holding that many persons, you'll have some idea of what the most evil regime in history of the world is capable of, and in the space of a single calendar year. But let me guess. People who follow God are evil. Wow. And of course, this was the only number of clergy. This was only the number of clergymen whom the Soviets murdered that year. They probably murdered many more that weren't clergymen. It's a level of wickedness that must take the breath of any sensitive human being away, but is, of course, merely a fraction of the far wider evil done in the name of eradicating religion by violent means. The Soviets, in the course of their adoption of what they called scientific atheism, murdered between 12 and 20 million human beings. Again, the numbers are too much to be borne. Let's say it again. Nowhere, even among the most egregious examples of religious malfeasance in history, do we begin to approach the scale of such atheistic atrocities. It's atheism alone, and especially scientific atheism, to use the cheerful Soviet parlance, that sought to murder en masse those whom they could not tolerate and with whom they did not wish to coexist. While we reel at these horrors, we may well ask, what can account for the disparity between those murdered by atheistic regimes and those murdered by people claiming to murder in the name of God? We might consider that those acting in the name of religion, at least ostensibly, look to human life so seriously that they rarely did the worst of what they did in the indiscriminate way that atheists did. Even the most evil actors, quote, in God's name, end quote, were somehow restrained. But those acting in the name of scientific atheism or atheism in general were under no such constraints. For them, life really was nothing special. So mistreating or torturing or murdering millions was in no way ideological different from exterminating vermin. Right, because humans are no more special than any animal. So there's no problem with killing humans. It was simply a practical effort, just as Hitler's murder of millions of Jews was essentially a practical effort. They were too much trouble alive, and so not believing them to be entirely human, or if they were, what of it? Since being human was itself nothing sacred, they should be killed, and killed with as much efficiency as was then possible. Actually, the efficiency of the Nazis in these murders could be praised as extraordinary were it not for the dizzying evil of what we would find ourselves praising. It was not, however, merely that outspoken atheists, or less explicit but nonetheless practical atheists like Hitler, felt human life had no practical value. It was also that they feared the mere existence of people of faith, knowing faith and its adherents to be a frustratingly resilient and powerful force against what they claimed was truth, even if they believed in no such thing as truth. And they feared that unless they wiped it out entirely, it would come back to defeat them. And in this they were, of course, quite correct. Thus, their brutality against people with sincere faith was especially diabolical. Anyone reading the books of Richard Wurmbrand, for example, such as Tortured for Christ, will have some idea of the Tartarian depths to which atheist state would go in crushing faith in the God of the Bible. In any event, as we've been saying, any nonsense hailed as evidence against the wickedness of faith cannot hold a candle to the unfathomable abysses of blackest evil perpetuated by those acting against faith. Those facts alone are enough to drown out the fiery arguments of Hitchens and his nihilist brethren 1,000 times over. Which makes us wonder whether their bitter books and acid speeches betray an ignorance of history unequaled among educated persons on their parts, or rather a bottomless cynicism towards their audience's ignorance of history. Or perhaps they betray some spiritual connection, perhaps felt, but of course by definition denied, with the forces whose dark deeds they so assiduously and sinuously strove to avoid mentioning at any and all costs. Among the cruelest wickedness perpetuated against persons of faith was their incarceration in mental hospitals by the Soviets. So many books have been written about these evils that one must again marvel at the ability whether via genuine or willful ignorance, or because they found themselves in some agreement with the perpetrators, the perpetrators of Hitchens, Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and their less famous ideological co-travelers in countenancing these exceptional evils. Yes, how can these contemporary people who make so much noise in the name of anti-faith, how can they sweep these things under the rug? It seems very disingenuous. Since they straight-facedly claim to care about human suffering at the hands of ideological actors, you would hope that the crimes done against people of sincere faith by atheists and in the express cause of enforcing atheism, such as we've talked about in this chapter, would be all they would need to change their views. But you would hope in vain. After all, what is hope? Can it be shown to exist by a falsifiable experiment? No. So, yeah, faith is not something that can be proven empirically. But yet, people who don't believe in God put faith in things regularly. They put faith in their car that it's going to start. They put faith in their body that it's going to keep them alive. One need only skim Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago to get a taste of what state-powered atheism was capable. But this heroic warrior against Soviet communism, who wrote innumerable books detailing the horrors of that ideology, did not begin life as any kind of anti-communist. On the contrary, he was himself pro-Soviet and was twice decorated for his actions against the Nazis while serving in the Soviet army. But in a letter to a friend just before the war's end, this military hero cracked a joke or two and referred to Stalin as the man with the mustache. For this mildest epistolary jappery, he was arrested and swept off to the unimaginable horrors of the Soviet work camps, where, for the first time in his life, he saw the reality of the regime and ideology for which he had so bravely fought. In time, his views changed, as we might well have guessed. As Metaxas first learned in reading Charles Colson's spectacular book, Loving God, Solzhenitsyn eventually returned to the Christian faith of his elderly youth and spent the rest of his life chronicling the evils of the Soviet atheist regime. We must return again to the 1966 Time magazine cover article from which this book borrows its antithetical thesis. It becomes obvious only in retrospect how willfully naive or ignorant the Western cultural elites were to the systematic torture and murder of anyone daring to question the Soviet doctrine of atheism. Because if they were not naive and ignorant of those things, how could they so blithely and thoughtlessly have asked the question, is God dead? As the Germans had done during their National Socialist phase, and as all totalitarian societies do, along with China and North Korea in our own day, the Soviets used propaganda to such effect as must at least be embarrassing to those in the West who ever accepted it. Of course, propaganda is a fancy word for systematic state-sponsored lying, which is done by these regimes without embarrassment because those who live in a world without God have moved beyond such bourgeois as good and evil, or lies and truth. In a world without God, including in the atheist utopias envisioned by Dawkins and Hitchens, such ineffable notions as truth are out of bounds, or at best are seen as the decadent luxuries of deluded persons. Truth cannot be measured with calipers, nor weighed, nor photographed. Why pretend it is anything other than a phantasm? The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, a dedicated atheist materialist if there ever was one, expressed this general idea when at the Tehran conference with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, Stalin said, quote, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" Quote, "For this cruelest of world leaders, only military might, which is to say power, is what matters, and moral considerations such as might be suggested by the Pope in any post-war agreements which occasioned his question, were by no means anything to be reckoned with. In fact, the famous phrase attributed to Stalin is most likely apocryphal, having been simplified from what he actually said having been simplified from what he actually said when he was informed that the Pope might present and might have some voice in the post-war agreements which occasioned his question, were by no means anything to be reckoned with. In fact, the famous phrase attributed to Stalin is most likely apocryphal, having been simplified from what he actually said when he was informed that the Pope might be present and might have some voice in the post-war agreements between Soviets, Americans, and British. To this, he said, "In how many divisions will the Pope have contributed to victory over the Germans?" In either case, Stalin was expressing the atheist idea that the only thing that counts is power. Pontius Pilate understood this too, and in some generous interpretations of the question, what is truth, he can at least be seen to have been wondering about it, and possibly asking Jesus at least somewhat seriously for an answer, as though there were there still was some part of him that was interested in the subject. The Soviet monster called Uncle Joe was far past such sensitivity and was interested only in pushing the annoying idea of morality out of his negotiations. He wanted to be able to do what he wanted to do and didn't want to have anybody telling him what he could or couldn't do. It sounds just like an atheist today. That is the end of chapter 20. And it is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas, where we looked at some of the atrocities that came at the hands of atheist regimes. So we see the hypocrisy of the atheists when they say that it's the people of faith, the people of religion, who advocate atrocity. It's a hypocritical argument. There are some things that are difficult in the Bible. There's no doubt about that. But we, of faith, can trust that God is good. And even if we don't understand all the reasons for why he does what he does, we can trust that he knows better than we do. So first, on the de-Christianization of France during the French Revolution, they were trying to do a number of separate policies by the French government during the French Revolution. They were trying to end Christian religious practice and the Christian religion itself. They ended in 1801. The French Revolution initially began with attacks on church corruption and the wealth of the higher clergy. And even many Christians could identify with these attacks, since the Gallican Church was dominant in that society. During a 2-year period known as the Reign of Terror, anti-clericalism became some of the most violent of any in modern European history. New revolutionary authorities suppressed the church, abolished the Catholic monarchy, nationalized church property. So they're taking church property from the church and they are making it part of the nation. They're exiling priests. They're killing priests. They're replacing the Christian calendar with the date of the revolution. They are replacing Christian celebrations with festivals of liberty and reason. New forms of moral religion are replacing Christian religion. The atheistic cult of reason is replacing Christian religion. So this is all attacks on the church performed by an atheistic regime during the French Revolution. So the vast majority of the population was still Catholic in 18th century France. But minorities of French Protestants, the Huguenots and the Lutherans, still lived in France. The Edict of Versailles did not give Catholics in France the right to openly practice their Catholicism, but only the rights to legal and civil status. So they couldn't freely practice their religion. The ancient regime institutionalized the authority of the clergy as the first estate of the realm. As the largest landowner of the country, the Catholic Church controlled properties which provided massive revenues from its tenants. The Church also had enormous income from the collection of tithes, since the Church kept the registry of births, deaths, and marriages, and was the only institution that provided hospitals and education in some parts of the century. The Church influenced all citizens. So between 1789 and 1792, the French Revolution abolished tithes gathered by the Catholic clergy. In 1789, the National Constituent Assembly seized properties held and land held by the Catholic Church. So during the French Revolution, we see attacks on the church. Now, They are destroying statues, plates, and other iconography from places of worship, oppressing places of worship. They're destroying crosses, bells, and other external signs of worship. They're threatening to kill priests and people who hid priests if they get discovered. This is this atheistic regime that is committing violence against people of faith. The de-Christianization campaign can be seen as the logical extension of the materialist philosophies of some of the leaders of the Enlightenment. It provided an opportunity to unleash resentments against the Catholic Church and its clergy. Right, in August 1789, the state canceled the taxing power of the church. The church could no longer tax to help, I guess, subsidize its income so it could function. The issue of church property became central to the policies of the new revolutionary government, declaring that all church property in France belonged to the nation. Confiscations were ordered and church properties were sold at public auction. So they're forcing church to no longer have its property. Let's see. Stripped clerics of their special rights. The clergy were made to be employees of the state, elected by the parish or bishopric. All priests were to swear an oath of fidelity to the new order or face dismissal or deportation or death. French priests had to receive papal approval. Let's see. Divorce was legalized, something that went against Catholic doctrine. So this de-Christianization of France was an affront to the Christianity that was being practiced at the time in the region. The Legislative Assembly dissolved into chaos. 3 church bishops and more than 200 priests were massacred by angry mobs. Wow, talk about violence against the church. These are the September massacres. Priests were drowned in mass executions for treason under Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Priests and nuns were executed at Lyons for separatism on orders of Joseph Fouché. Hundreds more priests were imprisoned and made to suffer in abominable conditions in the port of Roquefort. Anti-church laws were passed by the Legislative Assembly and its successor, the National Convention, as well as department councils throughout the country. Many of the acts of de-Christianization in 1793 were motivated by the seizure of church gold and silver to finance the war effort. They abolished the word for Sunday so that people couldn't talk about worship. The Gregorian calendar, an instrument decreed by the Pope, was replaced by the French Republican calendar, which abolished the Sabbath and abolished saints' days and any reference to the church. Boy, they're trying to oppress the Christians to no end. Let's see. Anti-clerical parades were held. Archbishop of Paris and Jean-Baptiste was forced to resign his duties, made to replace his mitre with the cap of liberty. So they're forcing difficulty on free religious practice. Street and place names with any religious connotation were changed. Religious holidays were banned and were replaced with non-religious celebrations. Churches were converted to temples of reason. Deistic services were held there. By early 1795, a return to some form of religion-based faith was beginning to take shape, and legalized public worship was reinstituted, albeit with strict limitations. You still couldn't ring church bells, you still couldn't have religious processions, and you still couldn't display the Christian cross. As late as 1799, priests were being imprisoned or deported to penal colonies. Persecution only worsened after the French army, led by General Louis Alexander Berthier, captured Rome in early 1798 and declared a new Roman Republic. It also imprisoned the Pope, who would die in captivity. Victims of the Reign of Terror totaled between 20,000 and 40,000, according to one estimate. The anti-church laws were passed by the Legislative Assembly under threat of death, imprisonment, military conscription, and loss of income. About 20,000 constitutional priests were forced to abdicate and hand over their letters of ordination. 6,000 to 9,000 of them agreed or were coerced to marry. Many abandoned their pastoral duties altogether. By the end of the decade, 30,000 priests had been forced to leave France, and several hundred who did not leave were executed. Most French parishes were left without the services of the priests and deprived of the sacraments. Any non-juring priest faced the guillotine or deportation to French Guiana. So, by Easter of 1794, few of France's 40,000 churches remained open. Many had been closed, sold, destroyed, or converted to other uses. Victims of revolutionary violence, whether religious or not, were popularly treated as Christian martyrs. Places where they were killed became pilgrimage destinations. Catechizing in the home, folk religion, syncretic or heterodox practices all became more common. Yeah, these are the things that the Orthodox Church condemns. The long-term effects of religious practice in France were significant. Many who were dissuaded from their traditional religious practices never resumed them. So this is the de-Christianization of France during the French Revolution. And then, when we look at the Red Terror, that's the name given by historians to various acts of violence committed from 1936 until the end of the Spanish Civil War by sections of nearly all leftist groups. News of the rightist military uprising in July 1936 unleashed a politicized response, and no Republican-controlled region escaped systematic and anti-clerical violence, although it was minimal in the Basque Country. Violence consisted of killing of tens of thousands of people, including 6,832 priests, the vast majority in the summer of 1936 in the wake of the military coup. Attacks on the Spanish nobility, business owners, industrialists, politicians, and supporters of the conservative parties, as well as the desecration and burning of monasteries, convents, and churches. So during the Red Terror, you've got religious violence taking place. Violence against the religious people and other groups, but religious people. A process of political polarization had already characterized the Second Spanish Republic. Party divisions became increasingly embittered. Whether an individual continued practicing Catholicism was seen as a sign of partisan loyalty. Electorally, the church had identified itself with the conservative and far-right parties, which had set themselves against the left. The failed coup of July 1936 let loose a violent onslaught of those that revolutionaries in the Republican zone identified as enemies. Where the rebellion failed, for several months afterwards, merely to be identified as a priest or religious or simply a militant Christian or member of some apostolic or pious organization was enough for a person to be executed without trial. All right, so in the Red Terror in Spain, you've got these between 38,000 and 72,000 people are being executed. Here's a historian who wrote that despite the fact that the church suffered appalling persecution, the events have so far met not only with the embarrassing partiality of ecclesiastical scholars, but also with the embarrassed silence or attempts at justification of a large number of historians or memoirists. So people are trying to minimize just how bad this was. Analysts such as Helen Graham have linked the Red and White Terrors, alleging that it was the failed coup that allowed the culture of brutal violence to flourish. Its original act of violence was that it killed off the possibility of other forms of peaceful political evolution. Other historians have found the evidence of systematic persecution and violence preceding the military uprising, have found what they term a radical, anti-democratic, anti-clericalism among supporters of the Second Spanish Republic. In recent years, let's see. So the Revolution of 1931 established the Second Spanish Republic, and the Spanish Constitution of 1931 also brought to power an anti-clerical government. The government is trying to repress the church. The relationship between the new secular republic and the Catholic Church was fraught from the start. The Cardinal, the Primate of Spain, urged the Catholics to vote against the ruling parties that wanted to destroy religion. The ruling parties are trying to destroy religion in Spain during this. Constitution respected civil liberties and representation, but articles placed restrictions on the church's use of its own property and banned religious orders from running schools or engaging in education. Just religious suppression after religious suppression. Even advocates of church-state separation saw the Constitution as hostile. One such advocate stated, "The article in which the Constitution legislates the actions of the church seems highly improper to me." So you've got even even people who are advocating church and state separation saying that the government is being too hard on the church. Let's see. The Pope condemned the Spanish Republican government's deprivation of religious toleration. One legal commentator stated plainly, the gravest mistake of the Constitution, Spain's last democratic constitution, was its hostile attitude toward the Catholic Church. The 1933 election. All right. The state political establishment had been brutal for some time. 1933 elections. Let's see. 1934, there's priests and religious people being murdered. 37 priest brothers and seminarians by leftists in Asturias marks what some see as the beginning of the Reign of Terror. The Asturian Resolution was strongly anti-clerical and involved violence against priests, religious, and destruction of 58 churches, which had been rare until then. Tehran, one of the locales of anti-clerical violence, a coal mining town, was a hub of anti-government and anti-clerical agitation. There was a Catholic school being run there. This enraged the far-left politicians, and when people wouldn't stop with the religious practice, the local rebel government invaded the brothers' residence, the De La Salle brothers' residence, pretending to be looking for concealed weapons. The brothers were arrested, held without trial, and executed by a firing squad. Okay. In 1930s. Let's see. Following the greatest anti-clerical bloodletting was at the beginning of the Civil War, when large areas of the country fell under control of local loyalists, and militias. A large part of the terror consisted of perceived revenge against bosses and clergy, and as they lost their powerful position in the social revolution, it moved toward extremism that took place in the first months of the Civil War. Let's see. According to historian Anthony Beevor, in Republican territory, the worst violence was mainly a sudden and quickly spent reaction of suppressed fear, exacerbated by desires of revenge for the past, in contrast with relentless purging of Reds and atheists in nationalist territory. The remaining days of July saw 861 priests and religious murdered, 95 of them on July 25th, a feast day of St. James, patron saint of Spain. August saw a further 2,077 clerical victims. After just 2 months of civil war, 3,400 priests, monks, and nuns had been murdered. Same day of the fatal injury, 52 prisoners were executed by anarchist militiamen as reprisals. Some of the Republican death squads were heavily staffed by the Soviet Union's secret police. During the first months of fighting, most deaths did not come from combat on the battlefield, but from political executions in the rear, red and white terrors. The terror consisted of semi-organized actions perpetrated by almost all the leftist almost all the leftist groups, Basque nationalists, largely Catholic, but still mostly aligned with Republicans being an exception. And contends that, unlike the repression by the right, which was concentrated against mostly dangerous opposition elements, the Republican attacks were more irrational, murdering innocent people and letting some of the more dangerous go free. Moreover, one of the main targets of Red Terror was the clergy, most of whom were not engaged in overt opposition. It began with the murder of some of the rebels that they attempted to surrender after their revolt had failed. Wholesale arrests, wholesale executions of people associated with right-wing groups or the Catholic Church. The Red Terror was not an irresponsible outpouring of hatred, but a semi-organized activity carried out by sections of nearly all leftist groups. Okay. Let's keep looking here. I don't need to read this whole thing, but you get the idea. Mob violence against the Republic's perceived enemies had led to the burning of churches, burning of convents, burning of religious schools. The church has sometimes been seen as the ally of the authoritarian right. There was no doubt that the church would line up with the rebels against the Republic. Jesuit priests were among the first volunteers to present themselves to the military authorities. The tragedy of the Second Republic was that it abetted its own destruction. The tragedy of the church was that it became so closely allied with its self-styled defenders. During the war, the nationalists claimed 20,000 priests had been killed. The figure now put at 4,100 priests, 2,365 members of other religious institutes, 283 nuns, the vast majority during the summer of 1936. Figures of the Red Terror range in death toll from 38,000 to 72,000. That's a large variation, but even 38,000 is still a lot. Okay, estimates on the number of religious men vary greatly. One estimate 30,000 priests and monks in Spain. 13% of the secular priests, 23% of the monks were killed, amounting to 6,800 religious persons altogether. Some 283 religious women were killed. 13 bishops were killed. We have priests, monks, friars. Bunch of priests in various places being killed. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church believed that the Red Terror was a program of systematic persecution of the Church. The attitudes of the Catholic side toward the government Spain was said to be divided into two hostile camps. One side expressed anti-religious, anti-Spanish, and the other side upholding respect for the religious and national order. The church was pastorally oriented and not willing to sell its freedom to politics. So, reported murders: 6,832 members of the Catholic clergy and religious institutes, as well as the killing of thousands of lay people. Parish priest was put through the parody of Christ's crucifixion. At the end of his suffering, militiamen debated over whether to crucify or shoot him. They shot him. A bishop and his sister were murdered in front of celebrating spectators by a special executioner. Nuns were raped by militiamen before they were shot. A priest was thrown into a corral with fighting bulls where he was gored to unconsciousness. His ear was cut off. A priest was castrated. His sexual organs were stuffed in his mouth. Some from the Catholic Church were forced to swallow rosary beads. Nuns were grabbed by the hair in the streets. One had their hair pulled out. Churches were burned. Yeah, you get the idea. There's just a lot of anti-church violence going on by anti-church people. So don't say that atheists are non-violent. They're not. Some are. With the total victory of nationalists over Republicans, the Red Terror ended in the country, but individual terror attacks continued sporadically by remnant communists, socialists hiding in French border towns with little result. Throughout the country, the Catholic Church held festivals to thank God for the outcome. I guess it could have been worse. 2007, the Vatican beatified 498 priests that were killed. Yeah, so a lot of killing going on. Now we can look at the Soviet Union. With its anti-religious legislation. And here we go. The Soviet Union had a state atheism aiming to gradually eliminate religious belief within its borders. While it never made religion illegal, the state nevertheless made great efforts to reduce the prevalence of religious belief within society. To this end, at various times in its history, it engaged in anti-religious persecutions of varying intensity and methodology. Believers were never officially attacked for being believers, but they were officially attacked for real or perceived political opposition to the state. So they're making up. This is just what they did to Jesus. They were saying that he was a threat to the Jews. Made up a false accusation that he was a threat to Rome. This sounds very similar. These attacks, however, in the broader ideological context, were ultimately meant to serve the ultimate goal of eliminating religion. This is the Soviet anti-religious legislation. Okay. Soviet legislation was regulating and curtailing religious practice. And then in this particular article, there's a bunch of this legislation. You have if you're in a religious organization, the records of that organization have to be handed over to the local courts. The religious ministers and practitioners are discharged. Military powers of the military clergy are dissolved. Okay. Vladimir Lenin, this quote over here, he calls religion spiritual oppression. He says religion is one of the forms of spiritual oppression lying everywhere on the masses of the people who are oppressed by the eternal work of others, need and isolation. The helplessness of the exploited classes in their struggle with the exploiters just as inevitably generates faith in a better life beyond the grave as the helplessness of the savage in his struggle with nature produces faith in gods, devils, miracles, etc. To him who works and is poor all his life, religion teaches passivity and patience in earthly life, consoling him with the hope of a heavenly reward. To those who live on the labors of others, religion teaches benevolence in earthly life, offering them a very cheap justification for all their exploiting existence and selling tickets to heavenly happiness at a reduced price. Religion is opium for the people. That's Vladimir Lenin. They wanted to separate the church from the state. Okay, they wanted to take away special rights or privileges on the basis of religious confession. This is the Soviet Union anti-religious campaign. Every citizen may confess religion or profess none at all. Every legal restriction connected with profession of faith is now revoked. No one may refuse to carry out his citizen's duties on the ground of his religious views, taking away religious people's freedom. Religious vows or oaths are abolished, taking away religious freedom. The acts of civil status are exclusively held by civil authorities. School is separated from church. Teaching of religious doctrines in state and public schools or in private educational institutions where general subjects are taught is prohibited. Citizens may receive and give religious instructions privately. Ecclesiastical and religious associations could not enjoy any benefits from the government. Religious organizations are prohibited from calling obligatory gatherings for its members. Okay. According to Church hierarchies and dioceses could not legally exist under Soviet law. Therefore, if believers received instruction from priests or bishops as though such people were spiritual authorities, they could be punished along with the offending clergymen. This made it extremely difficult for dioceses to be run except in a chaotic fashion. Gotta hide to worship. No church or religious organizations are permitted to own property. Any and all property that any church or religious organization may in Russia is hereby declared to be public property, taking away the property of the church. Constitutions, the right of religious groupings to carry out religious propaganda was taken away. All teachers of religion of all religions are relieved of their duties as of January 1st, 1918. Those who use a church building are obligated to give up the property to a Soviet worker upon their first demand. Religious processions is allowed only by written permission. All right. Very oppressive. If church or parish houses are rented out to workers, if the workers damage it, the owners of the church or parish will have to repair it themselves. Buildings assigned for religious use are supplied free of charge. Let's see. There's so much here. You could easily look at this link and you could see servers of religion. Clergy and non-voting members could not have a say in land allocation. Okay. In 1929, a new volume of anti-religious legislation was introduced. This effectively curtailed the church's public presence and mostly limited religious activities to service conducted within religious buildings only, which is essentially what many want to see in America right now. A religious society is a local association of believers of at least 18 years of age belonging to the same religious cult, faith, orientation, or sect, numbering no less than 20 persons. Religious society or group of believers may start its activities only after the registration of the society or group by the Committee on Religious Matters. Very oppressive. State used this right to deregister religious groupings. In order to register a religious society, at least 20 initiators must submit to the agencies mentioned in the previous article. Let's see, in order to register a group of believers, the representative of the group must submit an application. So it's just red tape after red tape, making it very hard to worship freely. Registration agencies shall register society or groups within 1 month. Let's see. They're making people who worship their places of worship shall be subject to regulations provided for in the present law. Contracts to use such premises shall be concluded by individual believers on their personal responsibility. Okay. Ban churches from using activities beyond activities beyond worship. There's no parish libraries, no organized religious education, no prayer meetings, no religious study groups. Teaching of any kind of religion in schools is prohibited. Priests were forbidden from living in cities. Religious societies and groups there's a ton. Prayer buildings and wayside shrines are subject to liquidation, which are registered in special Local agencies were state funds. Looks like religious associations had to have contracts, and if they didn't want to comply, their contract would be annulled. No freedom for the religion, for religious people. Construction of a new prayer building may take place upon the request of religious societies. Had to request. There's no freedom. The government has to regulate every aspect of worship in the Soviet Union. No religious rites may be performed in any state, public, or cooperative institutions and enterprises. Neither may there be any religious symbols displayed in state public buildings. Sometimes to have religious processions, you need special permission. And this legislation in 1961 was designed to assist anti-religious campaign, especially with regard to massive number of church closures that were conducted. It gave the state tight control over religious practices, and then it goes into detail what those tight religious practices are. Ton of things. Then we have this 1965 Council for Religious Affairs. This organization inherited the role of dictatorial control over religious life and used whatever means it could in order to disrupt or put down religious activities. Then you have 1929 legislation on religious associations that was amended in 1975. It authorized interference in the spiritual life of religious organizations. The religious are having their lives interfered with based on this Soviet Union anti-religious campaign. If you're going to have a religious conference, you can only do so with express permission from the government. A religious society or group of believers may only be used. They use only one house of prayer. Okay. They could close down prayer houses anytime they wanted and reassign them for public purposes. If a church is going to be insured, the people signing the agreement are going to have to bear the responsibility. You can look at this link yourself and you can read through these things. And there's all these other articles. Wow. Prohibiting the teaching of religion to children under 18. Wow. Okay. That's pretty hard stuff. Now we're looking at China and its violence against religion. The Chinese Communist Party, a series of policies and practices including the promotion of state atheism, coupled with its persecution of people with spiritual or religious beliefs. Anti-religious campaigns were launched in 1949. They continue to be waged against Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and members of other religious communities in the 21st century. State campaigns against religion have escalated recently. For Christians, government decrees have mandated widespread removal of crosses from churches. In some cases, they've also mandated destruction of houses of worship. Not just against Christians, they're doing it against Buddhist monasteries. Existence of forced re-education camps, arrest, beatings, rape, and destruction of religious sites. As a result of anti-religious campaigns, all churches, mosques, and temples were closed. Okay. Tibetan Buddhists. In 1989, violent repression spread in Tibet after prolonged rebellions against Chinese rule. Hundreds of Tibetans were killed. Persecution of Tibetan Buddhists escalated in the 21st century here, leading to the 2008 Tibetan unrest. This is Buddhist. This is violence against Buddhists. Okay, Chinese government and Communist Party from 2012 to present intensified anti-religious campaigns in the country. September 2019, the government of China is harvesting and selling organs from persecuted religious and ethnic minorities. Wow. The tribunal concluded that religious and ethnic minorities are being killed in order to cut open while still alive for their kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, cornea, and skin. They're targeting Tibetans and Buddhists. Nuns and monks were bussed away, reportedly detained in re-education centers. They're trying to brainwash them into deconverting them. Let's see. Beatings and torture of monastics and lay people at re-education centers and in jails after arrests. This is what the atheist regime of the Communist Party is doing. The atheist Communist Party is doing. Some of this in present-day China. Persecution of other spiritual organizations is also continuing. Officials have targeted Christianity, Islam with particular intensity. Over 1,200 Christian crosses have been removed from their steeples since 2013. A number of Catholic priests and supporters were injured while preventing a government-owned bulldozer from demolishing a church. Policemen put up a banner saying, "We must reject religion, we must not believe in religion." Chinese officials in 2018 raided Christian house churches just prior to Christmas and coerced their owners to close down. Christmas trees and Santa Clauses were forcibly removed. Crackdown on outdoor religious statues. The government persecuted Christians through the COVID pandemic. Also against Muslims. The Chinese government detained over 1 million Muslims. They forcibly took children away from parents. So it's not just against Christians, it's against any religion. The point is, there's violence that goes on against religion. Religious groups are not the only groups that are responsible for violence. Anti-religious groups are responsible for violence too. And this is just some of the examples showing that. So next time we're going to go through chapter 21, and we're going to begin to look at atheists who found God. Jean-Paul Sartre, Anthony Flew, and Albert Camus. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.
you.